I think I met Howard about 1970. We were doing some couple of shows. I wasn't producing or directing, but a couple of shows for WNET in New York. And we interviewed, two or three older directors. And I was very moved and touched by Howard and Bill Wellman and Raoul Walsh. And that was really the genesis of the series I did, Men Who Made the Movies. I thought it'd be nice to do hour-length profiles of those guys. And so I guess we kind of stayed in touch, and I think it was about 1973 that we did, this extensive interview with Howard. I mean, part of it was up in the desert. His son Greg was a motocross racer. And so we met up there. I thought it was kind of a Hawksian setting, And it was. I mean, it was a nice sort of wasteland of, it had on this Sunday morning a couple hundred guys with their motorcycles, and so it was a race, and it was all kind of very masculine. And Howard fitted in kind of with those people. I mean, it was kind of interesting because he was an elegant guy and an obviously well-educated guy and all of that. But, and these people with these bouffant hairdos and stuff would come up and start talking to him. And he was always very, very friendly with those people and very sort of accommodating. And then I guess at the end of that day, they started pretty early in the morning. We went on down to Howard's house in Palm Springs, and we did the second part of the interview down there. And I don't know, we stayed in touch, and when we premiered the show, he came into New York, and we had kind of a terrific 2 or 3 days there. And he didn't live that much longer. He had that accident in his kitchen and fell and died rather suddenly and rather, to me, rather tragically, because he was a very fit man. I mean, despite his, considerable age, he was very active and very. He did a lot of woodworking in those days. He was he built furniture. I think he was also out in his garage, sort of warping that stuff. But that's the kind of man he was. I mean, he was very practical, and he was very unpretentious, and he liked working with his hands. He was, even as late as late 73, he used his time in New York to have a couple of meetings with people. He was still hoping to get one more picture on, and nothing came of that. But he would have been completely capable of directing a film at that point. I mean, he was, he sort of moved and acted like a guy about 10 years younger than he was.
Actually, his last film made money. Rio Lobo was a success.
Oh, I guess that's probably true. That I mean, Howard didn't have an awful lot of flops in his life. He was a very shrewd filmmaker. His range was, in a way, kind of narrow. I mean, there were really two kinds of films he made. There were comedies, and there were these action adventure pictures that usually had a good deal of, I don't know what they used to call, male bonding and Hawksian women and all that stuff. But, I don't think that narrative originality was a huge issue with Howard. I remember him saying to me one time, he would go in to sell a picture, and he would, think of some movie that was currently hot at the box office. And you'd see walk in the guy's office, and he'd say, "What's this picture about?" And he'd say, "Well, it's sort of like," and then he'd name the current hit. And I'd say, "Oh, okay." I think also one of the things that's interesting about Howard is that he never really had a long-term contract anywhere. I mean, the most he would do is sign up for 2 or 3 pictures at a crack. The upshot was that he made movies at just about every studio in town. Warner Brothers, RKO, Columbia. I think, those studios, RKO and Columbia, they were a little more marginal, let's say, than MGM or Warner Brothers. And I think they left people much more alone to do their pictures, and they were kind of courts of last resort. You know, if you couldn't sell your picture at one of the big majors, Paramount or Fox or one of them, you're going to slide over to RKO and probably get them to do it, or Columbia. And the result was both of those studios, I think, had, in a way, better track records in the 30s and early 40s than the bigger studios did.
RKO made Citizen Kane after
Well,
all.
that's a notable example, but they also made Bringing Up Baby, and you know, it was a sort of avatar of film noir. There was, in the same way with Columbia. I mean, a lot of good comedies were made at Columbia. A lot of, you know, not just Frank Capra's, which were pretty good, but you know, sort of odd little items, and, you know. I guess The Awful Truth would be an example of one of those. So they were a little freer in their tastes and in their choices. Temperamentally, some directors need to have a good deal of creative freedom. And guys like Vincent Minnelli, they really, I remember Vincent saying to me one time that what he loved about MGM is if he had a brainstorm, he said, well, I want 10 pink elephants tomorrow. You know, tomorrow 10 pink elephants would appear at his stage. You know, they just turn them out. And he reveled in that, Minnelli, because, you know, whatever it was, they could deliver it to him efficiently. I mean, Hawks didn't make pictures of that kind. I mean, if you look at Howard's pictures, they're, for the most part, they're very straightforward movies. They don't have gigantic casts. They don't have, they're not spectacles. I think Howard, in his person, was an extremely dry humorist. I mean, you know, the irony was so hidden as to be almost invisible sometimes. I mean, there are moments in this interview I did with him where you really have to kind of lean in and you really have to kind of say, what is it he's actually saying? And then you would kind of hear the humor of it. And one of the things that, in revising this documentary I did about him, is that I think we're finding more of that humor and playing more of it in this version of the film than we did in the original version. So I'm much happier with this version of the film. The first one was done a little hastily. I think it was done by, I didn't know as much as I know about these guys then as I did now. So it's a better film. I think this whole thing about Howard and comedy was, you know, his framing was always almost staid. You know, it was very classical and very stepped back. And he kind of let the zaniness run through that frame. You know, in other words, there wasn't a lot of cutting. There wasn't a lot of frenzy in his editing or in his visual style. I mean, he really let the people do the activity. I mean, he always talked about people liking people walking and talking. He didn't like two people sitting in a chair and talking with one another. If you could get them walking through a city room like he does in, you know, with Cary Grant and Rosalind Russell and His Girl Friday, he's much happier. And that's a movie that's just full of that kind of movement in the frame, kind of. And it gives his movies a lot of zip. It gives them more zip in the comedies than most of the other comedy directors got in those days. I mean, if you would compare him, let's say, to Lubitsch, who framed a lot like Howard, but didn't have people move in the frame in the same way that Howard did. And I think that, you know, obviously carries through into his action movies where, you know, the emphasis is on the movement and on the action. But what's interesting about him as a comedy director, it is very, very, very apparent in Bringing Up Baby, was the zip and flash and quickness of those actors who could, as he liked to say, they could walk and talk at the same time. And that's why he loved Cary Grant, who was sort of a genius at, well, at all comedy, but in particular that kind of comedy. And that's why he adored Katharine Hepburn, because she could do it too. And that's, it's really characteristic of all his comedy. Even the post-war ones, Monkey Business or I Was a Male War Bride. There's a lot of movement in those movies, and a lot of, they may be on a motorcycle and it's moving, but, the talk is proceeding. And I think that's what made him a terrific comedy director. I mean, I think there's some part of me that likes Howard better as a comedy director than as an action director. I mean, it's not taking anything away from the action movies. But I think there was something inherent in his nature that saw the world in a kind of comedic way, and it would come out in these movies. Billy Wilder, of course, was one of the writers on Ball of Fire, and he said to me one time, he said, I was always famous for that yellow pad. He said, one time on the set I sneaked up and I looked at the yellow pad, there was nothing on it. That may be true. Directors need a device very often where they can pull back from the work at hand and just think and try and figure out why the scene isn't working or what they could do to make it work even better. And, I think Howard, would pull out his yellow pad and scribble whatever nonsense on it. That's just a way of stepping back from the activity. And I'll tell you, John Ford, whom he admired, was a great believer in that. Ford always, say he'd walk out of the set, he had the faintest idea where he'd put the camera or any of that stuff. But he would stand, with that viewer right in the center of the set, and everybody would fall back, and he'd look this way, and he'd look that way, and do all that stuff. He said, I wasn't looking at anything. He said, I just needed that time to sort of begin to think, where can I make that entrance? How can that person make the exit? How do I work this thing out? So whether it's an eyepiece or a yellow pad or I think some directors, storm off the set yelling at people just to get themselves 10 minutes to think it through.
Please stop talking so that I
Will
can
you
tell
please stop prodding me?
No. Look, I'm just trying to tell you that you've told...
Oh, no, I didn't. Why, if you hadn't been in such a hurry and had waited for my explanation,
Not my coat.
Your coat would still be perfectly all right.
Oh.
What is the matter with you?
Well, you see,
Do you realize that you're making a perfect fool of yourself? Now, look here, you can't tell me that I tore your coat. There's such a thing as being...
Oh.
Will you please stop doing that with your hat?
Well, just stand there, will you?
What in the world is going on
Oh, no,
here?
please, don't move.
Oh, I've had about enough of this.
Now, look, listen to me. Let's get out of here. Just start walking.
So
Believe me.
now you want to walk. Well, I'm quite sure that I don't want to walk with you. And I hope you realize that you've made a perfect spectacle of yourself. Have you finished?
Oh, yes.
Oh.
It's an odd combination in that it has, extremely good comic writing in it. But some of the best things in it really have to do with direction. I mean, that whole business where her skirt gets ripped and his hat gets busted and they have to walk through that fancy dining room, in very close proximity so that people can't see that her skirt is ripped up to her waist. That's really beautifully directed as a comic scene. And then there is, to me, what is the miraculous scene in that movie, which is, Cary Grant and in his negligee, and this old lady coming to the door, and this whole dialogue about why are he dressed in that insane way, And he leaps in the air, and his feet go this way and that way. He says, "I just went gay."
What do you want?
Well, who are you?
I don't know. I'm not quite myself today.
Well, you look perfectly idiotic in those clothes.
These aren't my clothes.
Well, where are your clothes?
I've lost my clothes.
Well, why are you wearing these clothes?
Because I just went gay all of a sudden. Oh, excuse me, I'm sorry.
Now, see here, young man, stop this nonsense. What are you doing?
I'm sitting in the middle of 42nd Street waiting for a bus.
I don't believe that word gay. That's probably the first public use of the word gay in American history, which is very interesting. Second of all, Grant had this kind of, semi-public reputation. People wondered whether he was a gay guy or a straight guy. He was, he and Randolph Scott had lived together for so long. And for him to sort of just do that, just fly in the face of the rumors about himself and do it so brilliantly and hysterically funny. I mean, it's a great moment in I don't know, in movie history, I think. And I don't know if that was in the script or where that was. It may have been in the script, the dialogue, and the guy in a girl's negligee, but what there wasn't was the playing of that scene, which is just brilliant, not only by Grant, but by the character lady, who was very funny in it, too. But, I mean, I think Howard adored working with Cary Grant. I think he probably, I don't know whether he made more pictures with Cary Grant than with John Wayne or not. But those two actors are the poles of his sensibility, aren't they? I mean, in the one way, there's the lithe, quick wit of Cary Grant. On the other hand, there's the kind of strength, solidity, and stolidity of John Wayne. And, those are the poles of Howard's temperament as a director. They're both expert at what they do. They're both wonderful presences in movies. They're both probably, amongst the real handful of actual immortal stars, stars whose reputations continue to this day to be large, whereas stars like Gary Cooper and the like are somewhat faded. I mean, in that way, Howard was very lucky. I mean, he was lucky that he had a temperament that matched with those two guys. I remember talking to him about that period of his life where, he sensed that the movies were changing. He sensed that he was no longer going to be able to make the kind of screwball comedies he'd once made. I mean, we're talking about now man's favorite sport, which isn't so terrible, but it's not great, And he said, he called Duke Wayne. He said, well, I don't know what's going on in the movies right now. I can't, but until we can figure it out, why don't we just make some Westerns? It's an odd thing to say about Howard, but, there was a sort of tenderness to Howard. It was hidden under his really kind of stone face, his kind of very, very sly, you have to pick it up on the third reading kind of humor. But that quality of his, and again, it's in the way he directed and it's in some of the subtext of his movie. There's a kind of a mother hen quality about Howard. He's got moving people along and, keeping them focused on their goal and not letting that little gosling over there get too out of the picture. And I think that tenderness was reflected in these, first of all, the male bonding whole issue is, I suppose, quasi-homosexual. But there's a lot of tenderness between those guys. And underneath the banter between, say, Bogart and Bacall, to take one of those pictures, there's a lot of tenderness and sweetness in there. And he was a much less, I think, overtly macho director than a lot of lesser directors were. I mean, there were all big guys like John Wayne and all that in there, and there were big guy issues in his movies, but there was tenderness in there, and a sweetness. And I think, I mean, don't forget that in Scarface, he's actually kind of sympathetic portrayal of an incestuous relationship between Muni and Anne Dvorak. I mean, that's pretty remarkable for a movie of that era. And again, what's striking in their scenes together, those two actors, is their tenderness, their sweetness with one another, their sense of being entrapped in something that's not exactly of their own making, but which they can't do anything about, and which they just have to live with. And so I think that was one of Howard's salient qualities as a human being and as a director. Now, he had terrible relations with his children and his various wives and all that stuff, but that only says something about the way all of us are. I mean, there's our professional selves and there's our private selves. And his professional self had patience and tenderness and a kind of wry acceptance of human foibles and fallibility. And that's what makes him a great director, of course. All that stuff. I mean, okay, I don't think the cutting off the finger scene is so funny, but he thought it was funny, and it was part of that maleness that he sort of accepted too. So, I mean, that's the kind of guy he was. He had, by the time I was talking to him, he had a sense of his reputation. He had a sense of his legacy. I think he was perhaps, kindly and giving to me as an interviewer because he sort of saw this film as a way of establishing his, credentials with posterity. I think Howard had, as a number of those guys did, a sort of disappointment in his soul. I mean, they had made, some of the best movies of their era. And they were not particularly recognized critically in the United States or in England or, now we revere them. They are the great auteurs of their era. But they were always shut out of the Academy Awards. I'm not sure Howard even got a nomination ever for anything. Hitchcock didn't. Raoul Walsh didn't. George Cukor was very late in his life before he got an Oscar nomination, an Oscar win. Same with Vincent Minnelli. I mean, and these Oscars would go to these, these stupid spectacles and, that which was best in American movies, the wit and quickness of them and the unpretentiousness of them, was never rewarded either at the Academy or critically. I mean, there's some, I think it's a famous book by Paul Rotha called The Film Till Now, which is a huge book, and it's all about Eisenstein and those guys. And, the only thing it mentions about Howard Hawks is a good all-rounder, meaning, he could do comedy, he could do musicals, he could do whatever he had to do, he would do. And, I mean, that's it. That's the critical comment in this probably 900-page book about world cinema, which I think stops about 1945. So, I mean, I think Howard would say these things about going to France, and he would. And he said, guys would take him out. We'd have a few drinks. We'd have dinner. They'd ask me questions. And this is to me what he said. And he said, I'm always interested in what you fellows have to say. And he said, and it always surprises me, because he said, I don't really know what I'm doing. He said, I only know one thing. He said, if it feels right, it's right. And if it isn't right, I stay there till I get it right.